So I'm Eilish Burke, and I am the project manager of the IDS-TILDA study. The IDS-TILDA study is the intellectual disability study to the Irish longitudinal study on ageing. It's exploring the health and well-being of older adults with intellectual disability in Ireland. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study. I'll give you a whirlwind through the design and some brief results, specifically around the health domain. The study itself is quite large, so I can only actually focus in on some specific area. And I will talk about the work that I'm doing in relation to health assessment and bone health specifically. As we have discussed today, longevity is a feature now for people with intellectual disability. In Ireland, in the over 35 age group, we've seen a 20% increase since 1974. And these figures come from our national database. And this is definitely an absolute success story, and it's one that ought to be celebrated. However, longevity is relatively a new phenomenon for us. Despite our growing older population, there is little known about the ageing of people with intellectual disability, as my colleagues have indicated. In Ireland, the health policy is emphasising ownership of your own health and responsibility for your own health. So people with intellectual disability need support in realising this. So what we are aiming towards is promoting lifelong health, postponing disability and maintaining independence. However, services do need to be reorientated in order to support people with intellectual disability make this change. In Ireland, historically, people with intellectual disability were placed in institutional care. And with recent policy change, our congregated settings report since 2010, the shift from to closing down these institutes and bringing people out into the communities is happening greatly. However, these mainstream communities and mainstream services do lack knowledge in how to deliver services for people with intellectual disability. So in order to inform these mainstream services, we need to build a body of knowledge. And this is where I think the IDS-TILDA study can contribute greatly. Now, the TILDA study, which is the longitudinal study on ageing in the general population, started in 2006. However, they used a sampling framework, the GeoDirectory. And this was not suitable for people with intellectual disabilities because it got people's addresses. It didn't interview people in residential services or nursing homes, and it only used independent style interviews. So Professor McCarn saw the opportunity of including people with intellectual disability, because in Ireland we've got a national intellectual disability database, and we were able to randomly select 10% representation of participants from our database. So this is the first time that a comparable longitudinal study that includes people with intellectual disability is being run. It is harmonised with TILDA and subsequently harmonised with ELSA and the HRS study in America. So the IDS-TILDA study replicate the questions as far as possible, and we are advised by our scientific advisory board, but we also have a very strong inclusionary policy and inclusionary framework that underpins the study. We have advocacy groups that contribute to the design and assist with the review of language and the questions that are involved, and all the accessible material that supports the study. We've got a very multidisciplinary team from psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists, dentists, medics, pharmacists, and it's all led by Professor McCarn and Professor McCallion from Albany University, and Professor McCarn is in Trinity College in Dublin. Now, to take part in the study, we designed it, and listening to Chris talking about the 40, we specifically picked the age 40. It's different than the TILDA study. They start at the age of 50, but we wanted to ensure that people, for example, with Down syndrome, who present with older age conditions such as Alzheimer at a much younger age, were included. It includes all people with all different levels of intellectual disability, And we included 3 different styles of interview: an independent interview, a supported interview where people could bring along their key worker or the family member, and a proxy only. Now, the proxy only meant that people who were working directly with the person with intellectual disability answered the questions on their behalf. But this person had to know and work with the person for at least a minimum of 6 months, or be their family member or lifetime carer. Underpinning our study is our conceptual frame, and this covers all life domains. So you've got everything from physical health to social domains. Within each of these domains, we've got a series of modules, and within each module, we've got scales and questions. In total, there's over 3,000 items in our protocol that we administer with people with intellectual disability. So, for example, in the social domain, we're now including elements around transition and asking people about their choice of moving houses and their experience around that. So, as I said, along with the conceptual frame, we have our very inclusionary, our values framework that underpins the study. And this is to ensure that the person with intellectual disability stays at the core of our study. They're contributors, they're reviewers, they're participants, and they're disseminators. And the values framework also embodies the ethos of how the study and how the interviews are conducted. IDS-TILDA has developed quite a strong alliance with different groups of people with intellectual disability to provide a platform for people to meaningfully participate in shaping the content and the design of the study. For example, people submitted photographs on what they felt ageing was for them. We were able to create a photographic exhibition from this, and this raised awareness around what ageing was for people with intellectual disability, but it also heightened the awareness of the study, and we were able to use it for advertisement. Easy read material and accessible procedures that we've included in the study enabled 48% of our participants to self-consent, and over 51% required none or some support when they were answering the questions. We have completed 2 waves. 2011 was the first, 2014 was the second. And the red dots on the map of Ireland here represents the distribution of our participants. In the study, we had initially 3 elements, and we expanded this to 5 elements in wave 2. So the PIQ, which is the pre-interview questionnaire, is posted to the participants. This includes health questions, healthcare utilisation, medications that people are on. We post that a minimum of a week in advance of the face-to-face interview, and that's to give people the opportunity to get someone to support them in completing this. We then have a face-to-face interview using CAPA, which is a computer program for assisting the interview. And this assists with the easy administration of such a large instrument as IDS-TILDA's protocol. We have a family carers element, and we ask the participants who live at home can we interview their family member, and we administer the voice or the family carers questionnaire for that. And then we have, in wave 2, we included an end-of-life element. And we have a researcher interviewing carers of people who passed away between wave 1 and wave 2. And then the health assessment is the area that I conducted in wave 2. Just to give you some demographics in relation to the study, we have 753 participants participating nationwide from 138 services. This decreased to 708. So we had a very good retention rate, almost 95%. Predominantly females across a broad level of intellectual disability levels, between the age of 40 and 90 in all living circumstance. Now for analysis purposes, we combined our living circumstances into 4 groups. So those living at home, those living independently or semi-independently in group homes and in residential care. And this particular graph is stratified by age, and you can see that predominantly younger age group live at home and older age groups live within the residential type settings. Now I'd like to show you maybe some of the health results, just the comparisons, and again this is cross-sectional. Over time we do intend to sort of mine the data greater, and we'll see more in relation to causation as we move into wave 3 and wave 4. So between wave 1 and wave 2, we saw increases across a lot of the chronic health conditions. Epilepsy increased from 30 to 35%. Now, we have data in relation to the dementia, and our rates of dementia among our population of people with Down syndrome doubled from 15% to 29.5%. But with that was corresponding new onset epilepsy, which could explain this. Thyroid disease increased, gastro reflux, stomach ulceration, but something particular was chronic constipation. Now, initially in wave 1, we did think 17% was quite high for chronic constipation. We have a master's student investigating this particular area, and we included a second instrument in our protocol, the Rome 3 criteria. So perhaps just by introducing extra elements around asking people about constipation may be the result of or may be the indication of why it increased so dramatically. Other changes that we've identified in chronic health conditions were around sensory impairment. Cataracts, macular degeneration and glaucoma increased, and also around musculoskeletal area. And osteoporosis specifically is the area I'm interested in. It doubled between wave 1 and wave 2, the prevalence. Giving you some, just examining some results to compare with the TILDA, which is the general population study. We objectively measured weight in wave 2, and we identified in our population a 66% prevalence of overweight or obesity. That's lower than the general population at 79%. However, it's still quite unacceptable. Cardiovascular conditions were quite different, or were lower, such as heart attack 1.6% in comparison to 5% in the general population study, and hypertension at 18% in comparison to 37% in the general population study. But again, as I said, the osteoporosis was slightly higher. So the element that I actually did in wave 2 was the health assessment. And I was responsible for the development and the rollout of this particular area. We had 8 objective measures included in wave 2. Blood pressure, I did 4 measures, 2 sitting, 2 standing for postural hypertension. I did a timed up and go for a walking assessment, height, weight, grip strength for frailty assessment, and waist and hip to get the waist-hip ratio for cardiometabolic. And I also did a quantitative heel ultrasound to measure bone quality. Now, I wanted to maximise people's engagement. So I underpinned my whole philosophy around the inclusion of health assessments was an emancipatory philosophy, which is about demystifying structures and overcoming any barriers that may exist. So firstly, I changed the name from objective measurements to health fair, because I wanted to get away from that negative connotation of being tested or measured. I wanted to bring the health fair to the services and support people to engage in it. TILDA carry out an executive suite health assessment. This is the general population study. And they have centres, big centres in Cork and in Dublin where people have to travel to. I did it differently. I went to the people. I designed the process so that it would be an enjoyable experience, and I wanted to ensure that the focus was on the participant and that their achievement and their involvement was acknowledged. So I developed supporting material by engaging people in health assessments is quite complex. So I designed a series of accessible information material, from the appointment card with my picture on it so people would see who was coming, to the consent materials. And each of the health assessments I ensured that it was on one A4 sheet, no more than 4 or 5 points of explanation, and each explanation was supported by a picture representation. Initially, I ran a pilot study just to test the flow of the health assessment and identify any potential problems and rectify them before I went out and did the main study, and also to get feedback from participants. All the materials before I started the pilot study were assessed and reviewed by our advocacy groups. The pilot study contributed to the overall improvement of the process, inclusion of such things as augmentative communication, inclusion of alternative measures for people who had mobility challenges, such as the mid-upper arm circumference and the ulnar length. So overall, the pilot study contributed to improving the efficiency of the whole process to ensure that there was the least amount of burden for the participant. However, in saying that, some people came in and they wanted to go straight to the quantitative field ultrasound because it was quite novel or new. In total, I invited all the participants from Wave 2 in the IDS-TILDA study, and overall 604 people participated in the health fair, and 51% of those completed all 8 elements. I monitored those that didn't participate and just identify some of the rationale why they didn't. There were issues around transport and illness on the day, and then some issues around challenging behaviour and autism. But the majority of people didn't give me a reason, of 28 people, and some it was their own choice, or they arrived on the day and they saw what was happening and they decided otherwise, and that was fine. I do feel that what contributed to the success of the study was the emancipatory research design that I embedded in the whole rollout. The easy read information, empowering the person, ensuring that the appropriate and adaptive communication was in place. One thing that I used was this little small chair, and because I'm quite tall, I felt I would be towering over people. So I did all my health assessments sitting on that little chair. So I was at the person's level, and I had good eye contact and good facial contact. Again, as I said, the adaptive, being adaptive in your whole rollout of things, and acknowledging people's achievement. And this is one of the certificates I gave to people. And my colleague who's doing the end of life took this photograph. She was behind me in the field, and she sent it to me. And the person had framed their certificate and put it up on the wall. So they were very proud of having taken part. Excuse me. I did come across quite a number of challenges initially, and I'd like to describe some of the challenges and how I overcame them for you today. One of the areas was grip strength, and that it's one of the indices for frailty. We use a Jamar, and this is the instrument. Because I wanted to replicate TILDA study, I used the exact same instrument. You don't get any reaction from it. You don't even realise that you've squeezed it. It doesn't move that very much. So I would always demonstrate it to the person first and get them to look at the clock. So we called the front dial the clock, and I said, you're going to push the hands of the clock up. So when I'd squeeze it, they would actually see the hands moving. Then we practiced the whole concept of squeeze, because that was quite difficult for people. And I had a little small soft rubber ball that people would practice that concept. In relation to the waist and hip measure, when you're doing these measures, you're in a person's personal space. And when you look at some of the instructions, they say, hold your hands out to the side, and you're putting a tape around somebody's. I did it differently. I stood to the side of the person because I felt being in the personal space to the front was very an intimate type of feel. So I didn't want the person to feel uncomfortable. I stood to the side. I got them to hold their hands out to the front, and I got them to hold the tape for me. And I went around them. The tape I had was a Sika with the little clip on. So once we had that, they could relax their arms down, and I could adjust the tape to get the measurement. Although blood pressure was one of the assessments that people would be most familiar with, it caused one of the greatest difficulties. I was taking 4 measures, so that was quite a lot. And there was 1 minute intervals in between. It was an automated machine, so it really inflates and squeezes the arm quite uncomfortably. So I used a technique, really a distraction technique. I would get the person to keep an eye on the dial and watch the numbers going up. And as the numbers got bigger, I'd get them to look at me and start taking big, deep breaths. And it just was the distraction to get them over that hump. The height also caused a lot of challenges. People started going onto the standometer from the front, grabbing the rail at the back, which was quite unsafe. So I developed a technique to get the person to stand relaxed beside it. I had 2 foot imprints on the base of the standometer, and I would get them to hold my hands and do a parallel demonstration. So we'd step sideways. So they were stepping onto the footprints. And that worked far better, and they were more relaxed about getting it done. The timed up and go initially also had difficulties. I'd measure I had a standardised chair, I'd set it up against a wall, and I'd measure my course and put high-vis tapes specifically for sensory impairment. However, the first few times I did it, and if I started talking, the person would grab the chair and move the chair to start coming over to talk to me. So what I did then was I put a tape at the foot of the chair so that I would maintain my course. The instruction, when I did all the training in relation to doing these assessments and rolling out these assessments, the instruction was to demonstrate, give clear instructions, and then get the person to either practice or do it without any verbal instruction. However, that does not work for people with intellectual disability. They do need encouragement. And what I found was the tape on the ground, you had to touch it or show them that it wasn't an obstacle, because a lot of the times they'd come to the tape and stop or try to step or jump over it. So clear instructions in the very beginning when we started off. To avoid in relation to the quantitative heel ultrasound, you have to use isopropanol, which is 70% alcohol. That's for conduction of the ultrasound. And that caused the first lady I did it for her leg to shoot up because it's quite cold. So I developed a technique of when I was settling the foot into a position of actually massaging the back of the foot with the propanol from my own hand. For people in wheelchairs, I developed these platforms so that if they were in one of the high wheelchairs, that the instrument itself was able to come up to them. People really enjoyed it, and they really liked taking part, and specifically liked the foot, getting the quantitative heel ultrasound. And that's, I suppose, the area where I am most interested in. Measuring bone quality, and my own PhD is all around the area of osteoporosis. And the gold standard for measuring bone density is DEXA, which isn't suitable a lot of the times for people with intellectual disability. That's why I use the quantitative ultrasound, which scans the os callus. And out of the 604 people, 575 people took part in getting their bone health measured. Now, we know osteoporosis is insidious, and the complications are fracture. And in Ireland, we have 1 in 4 women who will fracture by the age of 60, 1 in 20 men. And 50% of them won't regain pre-fracture independence. But we have the FRAX, which identifies risks for the general population. However, for people with intellectual disability, the risks are different. And currently, there's no robust risk factor monitor for people with ID. Things like severe and profound level of ID with comorbid conditions contribute to poor bone health. Living in residential, where people are generally speaking are not as active and don't get out for as much sunlight. We're in the Northern Hemisphere, so we don't get enough sunlight to synthesize vitamin D anyway. Down syndrome itself is a risk factor because of early menopause, hypogonadism, and the fact that people with Down syndrome, their bones don't mature into adulthood, and specific conditions such as epilepsy. It's the medications that interfere, such as the anti-epileptics, interfere with bone synthesis. And then communication challenges, where people found it difficulty to have difficulty in expressing their own health needs. Now, as I said, we identified 16% of osteoporosis, a doctor's reported diagnosis from our wave 2. 25% of people reported they had had a DEXA scan, but from objective evidence, from the measurements I did, I identified over 70% of people with poor bone health, either osteoporosis or osteopenia. That means that 9 in 10 men and 7 in 10 women did not have a doctor's diagnosis of osteoporosis. Some of the risks I've identified include poor physical health, poor physical activity, low calcium intake. 74% of the females had gone through the menopause and 61% of them had not had a DEXA. And the World Health Organization identifies menopause as one of the major risks. 32% of our population had epilepsy and, of course, your corresponding anti-epileptic medication. In the general population, it's only 1 to 2%. 20% had a history of fracture, and of those who had a history of fracture, 65% had not had a DEXA. And a history of fracture, your likelihood of a subsequent fracture increases with following the first fracture. I have done some hierarchical modelling, but it's not complete. I want to include medications in this. But I've identified things like level of ID, difficulty walking, and level of physical activity. But poor bone health does not have to be an inevitability of ageing. I think targeted assessment supported can reduce this risk. But I think we need to be innovative and adapt our assessments to suit people with intellectual disability. Thank you.